All right, man, peace. So, brothers, sometimes the best laid plans of mice and men never truly come to fruition, because no matter what your overall end game is, assuming that you even have an end game, let's say that you don't, someone might pick up on something that you started and take it to a level that you never comprehended. And that may spur on a level of jealousy from you, because foresight is a gift that not many people have. There are many people who can initiate some level of enterprise, but they cannot see it to fruition because they don't have the foresight. And that, I believe, is the source of a lot of the antipathy between Colin Kaepernick and Reid and Malcolm Jenkins. I don't think that when Colin Kaepernick and Reid first decided that they were going to try to garner as much attention as they could for themselves, that they ever figured that there would be someone who would take what they quote unquote started and take it to its fruition. Because Kaepernick never wanted these protests to end. What he wanted was to bring as much entropy into the NFL as possible, because he represented certain factions outside of the NFL who needed to have as much chaos brought into the NFL as possible for a myriad of reasons. Well, Malcolm Jenkins kind of came up from behind them and usurped what they were trying to do, because to be quite frank with you, it's very obvious that Malcolm Jenkins was smarter than them both. Now, Colin Kaepernick had Reid as a part of that little conglomerate of players who were going against the NFL owners, trying to act as if they were negotiating some terms of peace or appeasement. And it's very clear to me that Reid was operating as a double agent. He was there to monitor what the other NFL players were doing while reporting back to Colin Kaepernick, who easily could have made himself a part of the negotiations, but he chose to not do so because he's operating from a stance of subterfuge. He needs that level of mystique surrounding himself so that he can continue to build up his own brand. So anyway, Mr. Malcolm Jenkins recently decided that he was going to try to appease Colin Kaepernick himself by extolling what he brought to the table, what he initiated, and also trying to absolve himself of what he's been accused of by Reid by stating that he's just looking out for his people. And just in observing this entire show, this escapade, it's very obvious to me that this is why you cannot have any type of quote unquote pro-black movement, because it's never going to come to anything of true value until we first address the fact that we have to try to stabilize whatever it is that we want our quote unquote culture to be. And it has to start with the men. It cannot involve any level of quote unquote civil rights or Marxism or all inclusiveness. It has to be the so-called black man understanding who he's supposed to be, because you're not black. Black is a color, it's not a race. So as long as we continue to try to push the quote unquote pro-black angle, it's going to bring nothing but confusion. When we study history and the many incarnations of so-called quote unquote black movements, it's always led to fissures, because you have different people who have different end games. You have different people who have different agendas. So anyway, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
I've always maintained, and every chance I get, to say Colin Kaepernick has started this. Reid deserves a job. Colin Kaepernick deserves a job. I can turn on the tape this week and our opponent and see that Colin Kaepernick deserves a job. But at the end of the day, when I started this back in 2018, my personal journey to help my own communities, it was never about the NFL or anybody having a job in the NFL. It was about people every day.
Right, but Malcolm Jenkins, you have to understand something. We're living in a social media world. So you have a lot of quote unquote woke pro-blackity blacks on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook who feel like you owe them something. They feel like every rich and affluent person owes them something, because as long as they can call you a coon or they can call you a sellout, that makes them feel like less of a loser. And that's the real problem that we have right now, or one of the main problems that we have in the so-called black community. So many of the so-called revolutionaries on the internet are not themselves willing to put their own best foot forward, because our people have been taught and raised to venerate and worship richness and celebrities and wealth. That's what our people have been taught. So therefore, they don't look at themselves as leadership material. And leadership starts in your own household. Colin Kaepernick is not going to lead our people anywhere He cannot even lead a football team. As a former high-profile quarterback, or so-called high-profile quarterback, he cannot even adequately lead his own football team. And for those of us who follow the NFL, we saw how he incrementally started to fall off as his poor leadership abilities became more and more exposed. That is why he will not publicly come out and make any form of commentary. Why is it that Malcolm Jenkins can do this? Eric Reid can do this. Other members of the NFL who want to be involved in various civic movements, they can speak out. But Colin Kaepernick is too good to speak out? And you still have all these woke idiots all over the internet trying to protect a quote-unquote legacy or a quote-unquote hero who obviously has no intentions of doing anything heroic. Once he went into his closet and rummaged through all of his old coats and gave them away to all the Negroes who were getting let out of prison, that's pretty much all that we heard from Colin Kaepernick. And supposedly he gave away $1 million. Isn't it interesting that $1 million is how much the government will allow you to recoup whenever you decide to give away a certain amount of money? Isn't that interesting?
Everyday citizens, where I come from, where I live here in Philly, and all across this country. And so at the end of the day, my decisions will always be about people.
After Eric Reid called him a sellout last Sunday, Malcolm Jenkins tried to set the record straight on Wednesday. Stephen A., are you buying Malcolm Jenkins' explanation?
I'm buying it because he said it from day one.
Absolutely. That's been his line from day one. But unfortunately, because Eric Reid is a man worshiper, he's looking for his boothang Colin Kaepernick to get credit, as opposed to keeping his eye on what the prize is allegedly supposed to be from a macrocosmic perspective.
When he and I spoke months ago, he said that. When I've spoken to several people familiar with what the Players Coalition was doing, they said that. When they were on a conference call with guys like Eric Reid and others, they said that to them. It wasn't about Colin Kaepernick. It wasn't about getting him a job. They all agree that they feel what is happening to Colin Kaepernick is wrong. Nobody denies that he's being blackballed, that he should have a job in the National Football League, that there's no way in hell that most of these quarterbacks, at least these backup quarterbacks in the National Football League, should have a job ahead of him. And clearly the reason he doesn't have a job is due in large part to his kneeling and the residue that emanates from it. Everybody recognizes that. But what Malcolm Jenkins said right there on video is what he had said to me and many other people months ago. He said the objective is our community. The money that we negotiated that we're going to get on behalf of the owners.
Look at Kaepernick with that one fist in the air.
Yeah, I'm finally where I'm supposed to be. I'm a black man. Yeah, fist in the air.
Commitment to matching what the players contribute up to $250,000 per team to directly help African American community as it pertains to causes that exist within the community.
The main thing that's going to help the so-called African American community is for the so-called black man to take over leadership of himself, and everything is going to trickle down from there. Once we take over leadership of ourselves, then we take over leadership of the household. Why is that? Because we're going to relearn how to pick the appropriate female to inseminate. I cannot harp on that enough. That's the most essential thing that the so-called black man needs to do, what all of us need to do, in order to initiate the appropriate paradigm shift that we're going to need in order to make what we're doing fruitful and beneficial for ourselves and then for everybody else. And when I say everybody else, I'm talking about our people. That's what's necessary. Not trying to extort the NFL owners.
He said that's what it's about. And that's what it's always been about, because it's never been about one person. It's always been bigger than one person. Josh Norman got into an argument.
Well, obviously, it was not always bigger than one person, because Eric Reid decided that he was going to try to blow up Malcolm Jenkins' spot right before the game. That's how you know that he must have been a double agent from the very start.
Argument over the phone with Eric Reid because of that very statement. It's not about it's not about Colin Kaepernick. It's about the bigger cause. We recognize what he has sacrificed. We recognize the consciousness that he must have in order, because of his willingness to bring attention to those things. But you do it for a reason, and this is the reason, not to get him a job. And that's what Malcolm Jenkins was saying, and I certainly understand it, because again, I want Colin Kaepernick to get a job as well, but this issue was bigger than him, and it always has been.
It's laughable to me that so many of the so-called proponents of Colin Kaepernick being restored into the NFL are doing it based off of the so-called platform that he's more talented than the other quarterbacks in the NFL. Well, Greg Hardy is more talented than many of the defensive linemen in the NFL, but nobody's trying to push forward with any notion that he should be brought back into the league. Why is that? So really, your platform is not that Kaepernick should get a job because he's more talented. Your platform is that he should get a job because you feel like his cause is more valid. And we know that Greg Hardy really has no cause, but he was pushed out of the league because he got caught up in the NFL being awash with the Me Too movement and the so-called reckoning of the modern-day liberal female. That's the real reason why Greg Hardy got pushed out of the NFL. And to be quite frank with you, I have no bones to pick with that. But at the end of the day, don't act like you're always in pursuit of having the best players in the NFL. And the reason why you want Kaepernick back in the NFL is because he's a quote-unquote better quarterback than so many other quarterbacks. Because if that was the case, then you'd be pushing for Greg Hardy as well.
I have no problem with Malcolm Jenkins, and I'm buying what he's saying. And I think that this is a common theme. Whenever you have a civil rights struggle, essentially, or there's an oppressed group that is demanding to be brought in from the margins and treated fairly under the law, and we've seen it in this country, there's always been a split between the more and less radical, for lack of a better word, elements within the protesting group. The more or the less radical will say that will be more political and will be more willing to compromise. And the more radical will call that group sellouts. And that is, I mentioned a couple days ago, the SNCC said the same stuff about the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right, which was more radical, saying, hey, you're selling out whenever you make a compromise. So I have no problem with, I find Malcolm Jenkins credible. Here is where I agree with Eric Reid. If it's basically like, what side are you on? I'm on Eric Reid's side for this reason, not in terms of his attacks on Malcolm Jenkins.
You're on his side because he's an agent of chaos, and so are you, sir. And this has always been my stance on Max Kellerman. Hopefully you brothers are starting to see it. Eventually you will start to see it. The super liberal Caucasian Jew will always take the side of the more quote-unquote radical super liberal Negro. And Eric Reid and Kaepernick, they are super liberal Negroes, believe it or not. Because there's a very thin line between radicalization and super liberalism. Because in order for you to achieve your goals of causing a paradigm shift in society where people can be socially engineered, you have to bring in as much chaos as possible. And one of the core aspects of super liberalism, which is really just a code for Marxism, is that you have to bring in the problem, already understanding what you want the solution to be. So you have to guide people towards the solution that you want. And the chaos that's caused is only a vehicle to bring about that solution.
But in terms of the larger point here, and you brought it up, Colin Kaepernick doesn't have a job. And
Well, you know what? There are a lot of people out here who don't have a job. Colin Kaepernick is not a victim. He's still making millions of dollars. He still lives in a high-rise apartment somewhere in downtown Manhattan. I believe Chris Carter states he lives in Tribeca. His girlfriend is still, if she's not making millions of dollars a year, she's up there close. And she is his handler. He's not a victim. He's not a sympathetic figure at all.
Essentially, when you boil it down, what Eric Reid is saying is that is paramount. Why is it paramount? Because either, in solidarity, the protesting players will insist upon the league not winning that fight.
What protesting players are you talking about, Max Kellerman? You talking about the 25 guys out of the 1,600 players? That's how you know that the media is confederate with the Marxist forces that are trying to push quote-unquote protest in the NFL. Because there are 1,600 players and they're concentrating on the 20 that are kneeling, and they're still concentrating on the one barely marginal quarterback who forced himself out of the league. Once again, Colin Kaepernick was not forced out of the NFL. He forced himself out. He opted out of his option to come back to the 49ers. When other teams showed interest, either he or his handler purposefully self-sabotaged the situation.
Or the league will win that fight. In other words, if Kaepernick doesn't have a job, they are making an example of him. And if players, in Reid's kind of phrasing, sell out, then you're allowing the owners to make an example of Colin Kaepernick. And in Reid's view, and I think it's right actually, that is the most important thing.
So, in other words, you agree with Eric Reid that bringing Colin Kaepernick back into the NFL is more important than assisting so-called black people, which supposedly was the platform that Colin Kaepernick was kneeling for in the first place. So therefore, you're no longer qualified to call him a martyr because you refuse to allow him to receive his martyrdom. You see how that works, brothers? They want their cake and they want to eat it too. They want to call Colin Kaepernick a martyr, but they do not want him to suffer. That's not how that works. And he's not even really suffering. If you're Colin Kaepernick, you actually should not want to come back into the NFL, because now you can take the energy around your quote unquote martyrdom and parlay that into other opportunities for yourself, which he's already done.
This moment, are you going to allow Colin Kaepernick to be unfairly drummed out of the league, or are you going to make sure he has a job? I think in terms of the hierarchy of issues here, that needs to be, if not at the very top, close to it.
Yeah.
Brothers, let me say this really quick before Stephen A. Smith answers. I'm always a proponent of utilizing the Aikido approach. What I mean by the Aikido approach is that in the martial art of Aikido, they do not believe in fighting force with force. So when dealing with the super liberal, you should never use force against force with them. You should always allow them to destroy themselves. Let themselves run themselves off the cliff. Because that is always what will happen with the super liberal, because they do not believe in boundaries or restrictions. They believe that anything goes, i.e. thelima, do what thou wilt. That's what they believe in. So the more you strive against them, the more they become a bigger and bigger juggernaut, because they literally feed off of opposition. When you respond to the super liberal by saying, you know what, no problem, go ahead, they don't get any more of that energy from you that they need to galvanize themselves, because they're attention whores, they're attention mongers. And that's why I always tell you, brothers, when you're dealing with the super liberal woman, all that is a concubine. You never ever argue with the super liberal woman. When she says that she wants to go to the club, no problem, have fun, because you're nothing but a concubine anyway. You don't get into back and forth with them. How come you always want to go to the club or to the bar every Friday, Saturday night? You know why? Because she's a $2 hoe. When you understand that from jump, you don't bring any angst within yourself. When you're dealing with these people who always want to be advocates of leaders that are super, super liberal, everything goes, everybody should get abortions, and everybody should be allowed here and there, and everybody should be able to do this, and everybody should be pansexual. Let them do them. They're going to destroy themselves. And they don't really believe in most of the ideologies that they're espousing. They just want to utilize as much of a shock aspect as they can to get as much attention as they can. And what you'll find is when you start to ignore them, that's when they'll start to conform to what reality is. That's when they'll start to say, wow, nobody's really paying attention to this bullshit I'm saying. Maybe I need to reel it back.
I don't disagree with your position at that at all, but I do think certain things need to be highlighted. Number one, like you just acknowledge, you agree with me on, clearly he had no business attacking Malcolm Jenkins the way that he did Sunday, in the manner that he did that. He was...
Sure he did. If he's an agent of chaos, yes, he did have business doing that.
He was wrong, period. Number two, one of the issues that exist in our community, and I can only speak for the black community as it pertains to this show, it's disgusting to me that every time somebody disagrees, they must be selling out. There are various ways to skin a cat.
Well, Stephen A. Smith, and I've already covered this, one of the main reasons why you have so many low-level thinking blacks who want to put forth that level of conversation about how everybody is a sellout when you quote-unquote disagree with them is because they're led by their emotions. You have a lot of very, very intelligent so-called black people who operate according to a solution-oriented thought process. But they don't want to be bothered with the bevy of idiotic, two-dimensional thinking so-called black people who always want to act like they so about it and they so revolutionary. And there are no works to back up their talk because they're not fit to rule. They're not fit to be leaders. They just rabble rousers. They're like little kids throwing tantrums. So you cannot get caught up in their little silly rhetoric and their low-level conversation. And like I always say, they either have to be reformed or they have to be removed. But right now, we can't be concerned with them. We have to be concerned with the so-called black people, particularly the so-called black men who have a higher level of cognitive function. because they have to be the leaders. You can't be a leader just because you talk louder than everybody. You have to be a leader because you actually understand things on a three-dimensional level. Because those are the cats who can plan and who can actually create, for lack of a better term, a play sheet. Since we're talking about sports, we can use a sports metaphor. A play sheet so that we can map out what we need to do. Starting with ourselves, then with our families, and then when those things get built up, then we form a network. That's how that goes. But these niggas talking about getting down on one knee and begging the white man, they're not fit to rule. They're servants.
And sometimes the black community, on far too many occasions, folks within the black community, not the majority, but some, are quick to character assassinate folks and challenge their quote-unquote blackness just because you're not directly aligned with their thinking on how to handle matters.
Because it's a mob mentality. And underneath all that bluster, they're cowards. Ask them what their plans are, they have none. And underneath all of that, underneath all that facade, all them niggas really want is a hug. That's all they really want. That's why none of their bluster can affect me at all. Because the one thing that I have in common with them is that both I and them both know that they're idiots. That's what we have in common. So you can never allow an idiot to affect you. An idiot is going to yell loud and get louder and louder because that's the only way that they can get attention. All right? When you know what you're talking about, you don't have to use a whole lot of hot air and bluster and so on and so forth.
That's a problem that exists within our community, and we need to address that. And
yeah, we do. Like I've already stated, they have to be reformed or removed.
And more intelligently, I might add. Number 3, Eric Reid, and this is the point that I want to get to with what you were just explaining, Max. At some point in time, is anybody going to bring up the fact that Colin Kaepernick never had a plan?
Ding! Brother, I've been bringing that up for the last year and a half. Where you been at? But once again, I'm happy that you're finally starting to get either the insight to recognize these things or the courage to finally say the things that you've probably recognized for a while now.
What's the end game? What are you after? What's the motivation specifically?
I brought that up from day one.
Well, I got it.
No, I
was talking about that.
I got you.
I was talking about the players because I'm talking about the players in terms of the Eric Reids and Colin Kaepernicks of the world. Because remember something here, Max. We talk as if they have a problem with the NFL. Colin Kaepernick was never protesting against the NFL.
Thank you, sir.
He was never protesting against the owners. And if you're Eric Reid, I ask a rhetorical question, somewhat anyway. If you have such a problem with how the NFL has treated Colin Kaepernick, and you're so hell-bent against him, why did you take a job in the NFL?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. But the reason why he had to come back into the NFL is because Kaepernick needed a tentacle. And the factions that are backing Kaepernick, they needed a tentacle. So the first tentacle is the new owner of the Carolina Panthers, and that's why I stated already in another video. I did a video about that a while ago. They were thinking about making P. Diddy the new owner of the Carolina Panthers, but they couldn't because he did not have the principal capital to even act as a real owner. And the other owners were not going to accept him. So they had to find a super liberal owner who appeared like he could fit in with the other owners. And they found someone in this character of Tepper, who has brought back in Eric Reid. And who knows, he might even bring back in Kaepernick. For those of you brothers who remember, there was some talk a while ago that the Carolina Panthers would bring in Kaepernick. And that was when Jerry Richardson was still the owner. So who knows what's going to happen with that. I could see them bringing Kaepernick, but right now Cam Newton is playing so well that Kaepernick's a guy very similar to a Tim Tebow. It's difficult to have him in as your backup quarterback because he's going to have such a verbose and borderline bellicose following that at some point you would have to put him in the game just off GP. So I'm not quite sure if that's something that you want to do, bring him in when you're a playoff contender. But absolutely, if Eric Reid, if you're so against the protocol of the NFL, why are you here? But once again, the answer is very simple, Stephen A. Smith. He's an agent of chaos. He's there to bring as much entropy in lieu of Colin Kaepernick as he possibly can. And all this is a turn-in anyway. When you look at the top, you see it says supporting Cap. Supporting is in red. Cap is in blue. They're bringing together a fire and ice. As usual, Saturnian principles at play.
But Kaepernick never started with a public protest. He started with a quiet, conscientious objection in his own mind to
Allegedly. But we all had to know that eventually he was going to be seen. There's no way in the world that he was not going to be seen.
Standing for the anthem, which was not a compulsory
I'm not
ceremony.
I'm not saying that he was obligated to. I'm saying that once it gained steam and you want folks to take sides, meaning Colin Kaepernick, Eric Reid, what side are you on? If you were not protesting against the National Football League, it's perfectly within an owner's right to sit up there and say, we think you're bad for business. And if you're Eric Reid and you're vehemently opposed to their treatment of Colin Kaepernick, why did you take a job in the National Football League since you are so hell-bent against it? My argument is they were never protesting against the owner.
Exactly. And just going according to Stephen A. Smith's line of thought, would that not make Eric Reid a sellout? Why are you taking money from an organization that you claim is inherently racist and that you're against how they operate?
I just want to respond again. Some things, some principles are higher than whether or not something's good for business, which is why
I agree with
Right, but that's not what he asked you. Max Kellerman, that's not what he asked you.
Anti-discrimination laws in this country, even if you think having a gay person or a black person or something in your business is bad for your...
Once again, do you see what the super liberal Caucasian, particularly the super liberal Caucasian Jew, what they do? They constantly try to equate gay with black. And that's been going on for a very long time. Why is that? Because they want you to think, as a so-called black man, that your plight is equivalent to and therefore should be linked with the homosexual movement and also the feminist movement. Let's not forget that.
For your business, there are laws against that. And I bring up constantly parroting political speech is something that I believe there's a higher principle here. Even if it's bad for your business, you can't simply make a essentially political ceremony and insist everyone participate.
Well, we know, Max Kellerman, that you're not a business owner. And if you are, you're being completely disingenuous. Because we both know that in order for you to be a good business owner and to have a business that is lucrative, you always have to do what's best for business. We know that. And you're going to eliminate whatever variables that you can that are hurting your bottom line.
And I think what happened here is Kaepernick quietly felt like, I just can't participate in this. My conscience tells me not to do it. And then it became a big issue. I don't think he started with a grand plan. Obviously.
Right, but once again, Max Kellerman, you did not answer Stephen A. Smith's question. And unfortunately, Stephen A. Smith allowed himself to, to fall for the old switcheroo. Max Kellerman went through some long meandering answer about Colin Kaepernick, trying to act as if he understood what Colin Kaepernick's motivations were, and he did not answer the question, why did Eric Reid come back into the NFL if he finds the NFL's practices so objectionable? That's the question, sir. Because if the NFL is as racist, quote unquote, as you allege it to be, would that not make you a sellout yourself?
Obviously, he didn't start with a grand plan, and I think that's the overarching point here. You bring it up, Stephen A. I do like to think that I brought this up from day one because this moment was inevitable. This was inevitable. Max, you frame it as the radicals against those who are willing to compromise. I don't think that's necessarily... more and less radical, but yeah. And those elements have existed in various protests throughout this country. That's not what I think this one is. I think what happened is you had, at the best, vague terms. Look, whether they have big meaning in today's society, concepts like social injustice and systemic oppression are umbrella terms that can encompass anything.
I agree, sir.
Malcolm Jenkins gave them form. He gave them purpose. Eric Reid said, no, what about Colin Kaepernick? But Kaepernick didn't kneel for his own purpose in the beginning. He didn't kneel for his job. It remained ill-defined. Malcolm Jenkins gave it definition.
And at some point in
Kaepernick
time,
still didn't have a job,
right? But at some point in time, somebody has to ask, and I'm just saying this. Somebody had to ask Eric Reid, what exactly is it that you want? Now, by the reports, articles written in various places, including our very own The Undefeated, it gave the belief that Eric Reid would not be satisfied unless A, Colin Kaepernick had a job, and B, he was the one leading the Players Coalition. You understand? Meaning Colin Kaepernick. So the point that I'm trying to make...
Right, but who's stopping that? You really mean to tell me that that Colin Kaepernick was not allowed to attend the meeting when you had more than one player who was a part of that Players Coalition who stated that he was invited to the meeting, including Malcolm Jenkins? So is Malcolm Jenkins lying about Colin Kaepernick being invited to the meeting? And why would he lie about that and go public with it when anyone could deny what he was saying publicly? It makes no sense, sir. But once again, Stephen A. Smith, you should have got back to the point that you had him on. That's why Max Kellerman, he's pretty much starting to, to bow out of this conversation. Why did Eric Reid come back into the NFL?
Make is that no matter what Malcolm Jenkins and those guys appear to have done, all right, Eric Reid was going to have a problem with it, with Colin Kaepernick not being a part of it. But my problem is Malcolm Jenkins, Anquan Bolden, and those guys not only reached out to Colin Kaepernick, they were on the phone with him, according to reports, and he made the decision not to necessarily be actively involved, although he supported them somewhat.
Let's parse that real quick. I know we don't have a lot more time.
Sure.
You're putting those two issues together: Kaepernick being involved or leading, versus and there's one, and then Kaepernick not having a job. I will say this: if Kaepernick were employed in the NFL, but he wasn't, but he was somehow left out of some leadership committee or not involved in talks, and Eric Reid still had a problem with Malcolm Jenkins, I would not say I'm basically understanding Eric Reid's point of view here. But the fact is, and I think the big picture, Kaepernick doesn't have a job, and what wound up happening is, instead of showing real solidarity, and this is my version of Eric Reid's view, and I'm with him here, Kaepernick doesn't have a job, and the owners have been able to make an example of him. And the background.
It makes no sense, Max Kellerman. How could the owners have made an example of him when they brought back in Eric Reid? How could they have been making an example of him when there are over 25 players that are still kneeling? How could they have made an example of him when Michael Bennett is still in the NFL? How could they have made an example of him when the cat out there with the Oakland Raiders, Marshawn Lynch, has been sitting for the national anthem for years? So obviously the issue with Kaepernick is not necessarily that they're trying to make him an example for what can happen if you go against their official edict of, quote unquote, respecting the national anthem. The issue is that he's too big of a distraction and not bringing enough to the football field to get a job. And it's as simple as that. It's not that complex. But once again, it's unfortunate that Stephen A. Smith did not hone in on Max Kellerman, because it's obvious that he had no response for why Eric Reid is back in the NFL if he feels like the NFL's overall protocols are so objectionable and so racially biased and so oppressive, quote unquote, allegedly.
The relationships of all these guys you're talking about, the falling apart of the Players Coalition, at least including Eric Reid and Colin Kaepernick, is laid out on the Undefeated. Right. It's really good. Really quick.
Oh, please. All that Undefeated bullshit. It's a bunch of house niggas trying to pose like they field niggas. That's all the Undefeated is.
But to be clear, Colin Kaepernick took a knee. We all support it. We all believe he's being blackballed. But the bottom line is, when he took a knee in a league that spans 1,800 plus players, you still didn't have more than 25 players taking a knee.
Thank you, sir.
Even before the negotiations.
We got to go here. We need to get him white ball, because some teams need a quarterback. One word. Well, one word. Okay, you heard.
Colin Kaepernick is not going to save any team's fortune. But you know what? Once again, like I stated during this video, when you have super liberal idiots like this who are concerned with narratives, the best thing that the NFL could do is actually bring Kaepernick back into the NFL on a team that can only be elevated through extraordinary play at the quarterback position. And once he flops, then everybody can finally say, you know what? He's not an NFL quarterback. It's like that person who broke up with their girl and you start to romanticize what your relationship was really about, and you give it one last chance, and then you're able to confirm, okay, that's why we don't belong together. That's what they need to do with Kaepernick.
You heard Malcolm Jenkins bring up the Jaguars when it comes to Colin Kaepernick. One word from each of you. Which team should Kaepernick end up with?
Jackson.
Well, no, actually what the Jacksonville Jaguars should do is they should bide their time and try to pull off a trade for that kid out there in Oakland, Derek Carr. That's who they need. They don't need Kaepernick.
Jacksonville.
Giants. All right.
I would love to see Colin Kaepernick on the Giants. I would love that. That'd be hilarious. The first time that Odell Beckham spazzes out on him and Odell gets attacked on Twitter by all the woke Negroes. Why you selling out with Kaepernick? Kaepernick's the reason why you still in the NFL. Kaepernick he's our savior. How could you turn against Kaepernick? Blonde-haired bitch. But anyway, we'll see where this goes. I do believe, I'm starting to believe more and more, and I stated this a long time ago, that in order for this narrative to build to an appropriate crescendo, Kaepernick is eventually going to have to get another opportunity in the NFL, and I believe that somewhere down the road he will. So peace.